simply going to harvest your organs.
Huh?
I was casually making my way through the new Fallout series when it got to this sequence where the main character Lucy has to escape from an organ harvesting facility. Just as the rest of the show up until that point, it was pretty fun in a darkly twisted, satirical kind of way. Anyways, Lucy's plan slightly backfires, but she manages to get out on top nevertheless. And it was here, as she set out again to continue her post-apocalyptic adventure, that I had this unexpected light bulb moment where I suddenly said to myself, there it is. That's how you adapt a video game.
For me, well, I do this shit for the love of the game.
This video is not going to be about Fallout as much as it is about finally having a good case study from which we can form a proper articulation of the key to successfully adapting a video game. For while there already is a general consensus that a good adaptation has to be faithful to the source material, what that really means when it comes to video games has always felt rather vague to me. Because sure, you can directly copy-paste the story from the cutscenes and fill the sets with the exact items you can also find in the games.
We were sharing the files right from the games and they were 3D printing things.
All that is great, but this alone doesn't seem like it's enough. In fact, we've already seen that it's not enough. Clearly there's something missing in our discussions here, some vital element that adaptations also have to consider beyond just staying true to the narrative, the set pieces and the overall iconography. And that missing piece, I think, is the one thing that actually defines video games, and arguably the only aspect of them that cannot be directly carried over to cinema or television. And that's the gameplay, or more broadly speaking, the player's engagement with the virtual world. For how do you faithfully adapt player interactivity to a passive medium? This is where the true act of transformation or translation has to happen. This is where the real challenge of adapting video games lies. Because unlike with literature, for example, which has been the source of cinematic adaptations for virtually as long as movies have been around, there haven't been any clear principles or proven methods yet for translating gameplay, for translating interactivity. That is, until now. But in order to understand what had to change, understand what Fallout did differently, we first have to understand the philosophical concept known as qualia. You may have heard of the thought experiment commonly referred to as Mary's Room, which was proposed in 1982 by philosopher Frank Jackson. In short, the imaginary scenario presents a brilliant scientist named Mary who lives inside a black and white room. Though completely closed off from the outside world, she does have a black and white television monitor and plenty of black and white books to learn everything there is to know about that outside world, including its colors. But here's the thing, despite her knowing all about color, its variations, its functionality, etc., she has never actually seen it. And therefore, as the argument suggests, Mary actually doesn't know all about color, and won't know everything there is to know about it until she steps outside and sees it for herself. Because only then will she learn the one thing that she couldn't possibly learn from within her black and white room. That's when she will learn what it is like to experience color. The reason I bring this up is because I believe there is a qualia to playing video games, a what it is like to be immersed in and interacting with a virtual world. And this is exactly what has been missing in so many video game adaptations, which feel more like they've been created from within that black and white room where they could only gather some factual and informational tidbits about a game but didn't know what it is like to actually play them. Like, that first-person scene in the 2005 adaptation of Doom is a fun visual reflection of the gaming medium. That airplane sequence in Uncharted did look like it came straight from the game it was based on, and that Assassin's Creed movie did seem to cover its bases by including the leap of faith, the hidden blades, and plenty of free running, which are all essential parts of the game. But while including these things can be a fun and sometimes even a vital part of a successful adaptation, they do not necessarily cover the fullness of a game's qualia. For qualia is not to be confused with the mere presence of references or other gaming elements that are directly recognizable. Movies that rely solely on this, which we have seen plenty of, feel more like they were adaptations of the properties rather than of the actual games, and therefore have more in common with the adaptations of non-gaming brands such as Barbie or Lego.
Oh, girl, you okay?
No, adapting the qualia of video games is about something deeper than that. It's about how a game makes you feel, how it puts you into a certain mode of engagement. To draw a brief comparison with comic book adaptations, I think that part of the reason why modern superhero movies became so widely successful is that they finally figured out that adapting comic books is not about superficial associations or shallow iconography. It is, in its essence, about capturing what it feels like to read comic books, about capturing the subjective experience of comic book reading. This can mean different things depending on different comics and on the different filmmakers and studios that are doing the adapting. After all, with qualia being defined by subjective experience, the idea of having one objective or singular articulation of it is inherently undermined. But let's put a pin in that for now. To name a few examples, I think the early Spider-Man movies and the Nolan Batman trilogy captured the qualia of their respective comics by treating these stories seriously, as their readers do, and by recognizing that they are just as informative and thematically rich as any other piece of literature. Marvel arguably took this one step further by also fully integrating the sort of experiential relationship between comic books and their readers into their entire production model, recreating that feeling of following different heroes and becoming invested in their stories over the course of multiple adventures that all take place in one shared universe, where they can occasionally team up and show down in exhilarating crossover stories. This, I'd say, at least for the duration of the Infinity Saga, was a great encapsulation of the qualia of the Marvel comic books. And so, going back to adapting video games, assuming this more inside-out perspective, this more experiential approach implies, most obviously, that those who adapt a video game should have actually played the game they're adapting, or at least know what it's like to play video games in general, or at the very least, have made a thorough effort to ascertain information that is specifically about the what it is likeness of playing video games. But secondly, and this is the challenging part, it means that you have to figure out how to translate to a passive medium the qualia of an interactive one. And to me, this is where the Fallout show has been particularly revelatory.
Okie dokie.
But before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, I do think it's important to acknowledge that part of the reason why recent video game adaptations have been more successful is not so much because filmmakers got that much better at adapting them, but rather because video games themselves have been becoming increasingly cinematic and narrative-driven. Or to put it like this, because the qualia of some video games has already grown to resemble more closely that of movies and TV shows.
I think it's stuck. It's not...
What? No. Oh, ha.
While certainly not being the first game to have a well-written, mature story, The Last of Us did raise the bar significantly when it came to utilizing new motion capture technologies that allowed for much more realistic performances and dramatic storytelling, which in turn resulted in a narrative-driven experience that, at the time, was hailed as being on the same level as that of any serious movie or TV show. And so, when the adaptation eventually came around, I think it's fair to say that the game was already meeting it halfway. And this is not only because much of the writing and the cinematic language could be reproduced almost verbatim,
Okay.
but also because the qualia of The Last of Us, the essence of its experience, was already defined in large part by the immersion into its narrative. For me at least, The Last of Us was not a game about shooting zombies, it was not about moving ladders around to solve environmental puzzles. It was about spending time with the characters, about going on that journey with them, growing closer to them, and coming to care deeply about them. And more generally, to play The Last of Us is to venture through a world that has been corrupted by predacity and hostility. A world where you never feel truly safe, where it always feels like you're one ambush or one betrayal away from violence and death. And yet, it is also a world that still contains real beauty. In fact, it often feels like it's as beautiful as it has ever been. And in those brief moments where things quiet down, there's a real tranquility that washes over you. A reaffirmation of some kind of connectedness, some kind of love and goodness that suddenly makes everything else, all those hardships and sorrows, feel like a bad dream, a distraction from that which should have been your only concern from the start. That's the qualia of The Last of Us, and I think the TV series captured that same feeling pretty well. If I had to nitpick, I do think that the bond that develops between Joel and Ellie would have been even more convincing and impactful if we got to spend a bit more time with them. I get that the game aspired to high drama and that the show reflects that, but to me, this approach where you have fewer episodes but each of them is top tier does slightly underestimate how in the game, so much of the narrative impact came from everything that happens in between the big story moments, in those stretches of empty space that the show just wasn't quite able to capture with its given format. However, having said that, while having made some sacrifices in this regard, I also believe the series was able to improve on the story in some other areas that the game struggled with. But I'll come back around to this later. First, let's talk about Fallout now. Unlike The Last of Us, adapting Fallout wasn't nearly as straightforward, though being blessed with very strong iconography and a very recognizable overall aesthetic. The game is also almost entirely experienced from the player's perspective, mostly in first person, which includes most of the dialogues and storytelling. In other words, there are little to no cutscenes here that already dictate an easily transferable cinematic language. And more importantly, Fallout is an open-world role-playing game, meaning that instead of having one linear narrative that players have to follow, they can basically do whatever. There is a main narrative, sure, but there's also secondary storylines, there are quests and errands to complete, dungeons to clear out, items to collect, skills to level up, weapons to craft, armor to create, and on the list goes. And even if you have done all of that, you can do it all over again in a different way. Like many open-world RPGs, players don't just participate in a story, they create one for themselves. Though the design of this agency is not always as intricate as some players hope for, it does always give them some choice that lets them direct the course of the narrative, which obviously makes games like these even harder to adapt. There simply isn't one definitive storyline here. So now for the big question then. How did the creators of the show pull this off? How did they translate all these video gamey elements that seem so fundamentally incompatible with the passive linear storytelling of a TV series, while still remaining true to their qualia? Well, here's how. And warning, there's gonna be some spoilers here.
My name is Lucy McLean, and I'm an active contributor to the well-being of my community.
The first and, in hindsight, most obvious act of translation was to take that open-ended, player-centric perspective and spread it out over multiple characters. In Fallout we follow 3 main protagonists, each of which are layered with the different stages that the player moves through, as well as with different playstyles they can assume. Lucy clearly captures the newly introduced player by being a vault dweller who is suddenly thrown into the strange, unfamiliar open world with a high sense of idealism and a bit of naivete about how everything works.
I just want to ask you for directions.
Okay.
Maximus is on that proper hero quest, though also a little impatient and not afraid to take the occasional shortcut. And Cooper is that veteran who spent enough time in the game to know it inside out and to attain that somewhat detached, meta relation to it. You know, he's no longer as genuinely immersed in the story as Lucy is, and approaches the game world as more of a playground. But besides these general sort of gaming archetypes, there's also a wide variety of smaller interactions and experiences that are wonderfully captured, both by the main characters as well as by some of the other ones. To name but a few, there's that all too recognizable moment of confidently going into some dungeon only to realize you're vastly underleveled. There's that thing that always gets in the way while you actually set out to do something else.
The Wasteland's got its own golden receiver.
Oh, what's that?
Thou shalt get sidetracked by bullshit every goddamn time.
The broader narrative structure of the TV show format also reflects this more episodic flow very well. Though I do want to add that this doesn't automatically make the TV series the best way to adapt all video games. There's plenty of them for which I think a movie would be the better fit, and that would only feel needlessly stretched out, as some games already do, if they were adapted for television. Again, it's about really looking at that qualia, about considering the true essence of your engagement with the material. Anyways, there's that frustration with low-level weapons that can't seem to hit anything.
God, it sucked without a scope.
The satisfaction when, 50 hours and dozens of invested skill points later, you did finally become the absolute apex predator. And then, of course, there's the beautiful awkwardness of failing a speech check.
Sorry? Intercourse?
No, Titus.
I'm sure there are many more connections like these to be made, and that is precisely why this works so well, because it's in that multitude of different scenarios, dialogues and character moments that each relate to some aspect of the what it is like of playing the game, that the show is able to capture the qualia of Fallout in its fullness, or at least as close as one can reasonably expect from a TV adaptation. And the fascinating thing about this is that by getting this right, by really capturing the more experiential foundation of the game and integrating it into the fundamental fabric of the TV show, all those other references, associations, little details and Easter eggs that so easily could have been all that the show was. You know, just a lackluster tourist guide through Fallout's iconography, instead immediately feels so much more meaningful. Makes them feel like a genuine expression instead of a mere impression. That moment when Lucy stepped out of the organ harvesting facility, for example, that moment where this entire video was conceived, wasn't impactful because I recognized the armor she was wearing, which for those who don't know is one that you can actually find in the game. No, it was because of the totality of that sequence, the way it captured that feeling of getting caught up in a side quest that wasn't at all what you thought it would be, where you learn some new things, gain some experience points, face some unintended consequences of your own actions, grab some new gear and then emerge back into the world wiser and stronger and ready to do it all over again. That's what this moment made me remember about the game. A feeling, an experience, a qualia. The armor was just the little cherry on top. That last bit of affirmation telling me that yes, these showrunners understand what Fallout is like. They know what it's about.
Oh, he's gonna find out.
This became especially clear to me towards the end of the series, when the show had to prove it could stick the landing beyond translating the varying gameplay experiences. For as much as players like to just wander about the wasteland, at the end of the day, Fallout does have a story. And more generally, it has a story world. It has a tone, a vibe, it has lore and history, and it has thematic and philosophical substance. There's ideas and meanings here that are all part of the qualia, part of the broader experience of playing Fallout. And to best explain how the show adapted this part of the game, do you know that line, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism"? Well, to me it has always felt like Fallout took that statement and just absolutely went to town with it. Because while there is the obvious economic or societal aspect of it, you know, the understanding that capitalism prefers war over peace, benefits more from sickness than from health, and when left unchecked will rather cheat its way to dominance and monopoly than engage in honest competition.
That is how we will win the great game of capitalism.
The world of Fallout is also one where these principles and mechanics are stretched so far into the absurd that it becomes something more existential, something that touches on the deeper psychological driving forces of the human condition.
War never changes, but there's always somebody behind the wheel.
Playing through Fallout is to confront a world wrecked by hubris, by megalomania, by that lust for power and wealth that is not just destructive, but also so obviously and so absurdly self-defeating that it becomes strangely comedic.
Initiate Protocol 53.
The show too effectively conveys this. In some ways even more clearly, by really hammering home how the end of the world does not mean the end of capitalism at all. In fact, here the end of the world is just another day in the office for capitalism. It's just another grift. born from greed and from a delusion so misguided and yet so persistent that even in a scenario where it has ruined everything, it still tries to squeeze out a little bit more, still believes it can get out on top, and still is ready to debase itself further to achieve that.
That's how Vault-Tec deals with competition, just like they did 200 years ago. By dropping the bomb ourselves.
And yet it's not all cynicism and fatalism. In one of the show's final twists, we come to learn that the grand plan of the corporate villains initially failed. That instead of waking up to an empty playing field ready for their dominion, they found a world where humanity was born anew, where communities were still alive and well. In fact, they failed so miserably that they had to commit another atrocity, and yet again, their effort was unsuccessful, for life in the wasteland continued. And it is exactly here that we find the story's counter-argument to all of the doom and gloom. In some way, the entire existence of the world of Fallout as we come to know it in the post-apocalypse stands as a testament for that idea that our humanity can never fully be tamed and controlled, can never truly be conquered by even the most destructive and most remorseless of systems. It captures quite beautifully the fundamental capacity for resistance that in the game is also embedded in that basic attribute of player freedom, in their given choice to either accept that more cynical and fatalistic interpretation of human nature proposed by the story's darker figures, or to instead try and stand for something else, to become a force that rebuilds instead of destroys, connects instead of divides, and that generally grows closer to and more invested in the world it inhabits.
You coming?
Okie dokie.
And so, while I wouldn't necessarily call the Fallout show a masterpiece or anything like that, for me it did feel like the first video game adaptation that wasn't just a shallow impression of a familiar property, or a good but easy retelling of a game that already had one foot in another medium. Instead, it was an adaptation that really demonstrated its experiential knowledge of the game, and that took a real creative leap, performed a true act of translation, to not only give us an entertaining show that felt genuinely faithful to the source material, but that also helped us to better understand what faithfully adapting a video game really means, helped us to better understand the importance of articulating the qualia, the what it is likeness of playing a game and being immersed in its virtual world. As a fun side note, it's because of this that we can now also understand why some movies and TV shows that aren't based on video games can still feel like them. It's because they, whether by design or by accident, contain some elements that are often associated with the qualia of video games. My personal favorite example of this would be Edge of Tomorrow, which has a time loop mechanic that just feels like playing a particularly difficult video game level where you are constantly defeated and sent back to the latest checkpoint. But then again, that might just be me. For as I alluded to earlier, qualia is an inherently subjective concept. Everyone has their own individual experience of what it is like to play a game, or for that matter to watch a movie, read a book, or interact with any other work of art. And because of this, any adaptation of qualia is inherently denied any form of definitiveness. There's just no way to please everyone, no way to get it objectively right. Believe it or not, but there's even people who don't really like Peter Jackson's interpretation of The Lord of the Rings. But at the same time, this open-endedness is also what keeps a work fresh and alive. It's what allows different creative voices to offer new interpretations of the same material, and in doing so to directly or indirectly offer commentaries to it as some aspects of the original work are inevitably removed, expanded upon, or changed in some way or another. And this, to conclude, leads us into the question of why. Why should we want video game adaptations in the first place? In his video on video game adaptations, Patrick Willems brings up the work of Linda Hutcheon, who pointed out that each medium has different means of expression and so can aim at certain things better than others. Going back to The Last of Us, one thing that was significantly changed from the original was the story of Bill, who in the game is a secondary character that you briefly tag along with, but who in the series gets this expanded backstory that not only lets us experience his beautiful story in a way that the video game probably couldn't have, but also emphasizes more strongly those broader themes of The Last of Us that we talked about earlier. For if I had one criticism about The Last of Us video game, especially the second part, is that it's aspiring so much towards that cinematic experience that it starts to feel like the gameplay is holding it back, and at times even contradicts it. If you're an experienced gamer, I know you have heard of, and might already be tired of, the term ludonarrative dissonance, which points to that disconnect that can sometimes arise between a story a game wants to tell and the story that is actually experienced through the gameplay. In The Last of Us Part 2, for example, Ellie goes on a revenge quest that slowly takes its toll on her physical and psychological well-being. But this story is not quite reflected by the gameplay, in which you collect bonus points and items and improve your attributes and skills along the way. In other words, the gameplay offers a progressive experience, whereas the narrative tries to convey a regressive one. I actually have an hour-long video on The Last of Us games that goes way deeper into all of this and more if you're interested. But for now, the important thing is that different mediums have different strengths and weaknesses. And one strength that TV and cinema have compared to video games is that they generally have more control over their narrative and thematic content, and can therefore articulate some aspects of a video game story more explicitly, extensively, and more clearly in their adaptations.
That's why men like you and me are here. We have a job to do.
But personally speaking, perhaps the greatest value of having good video game adaptations is that it allows me to share stories that have meant something to me with more people than I could before. Like so many other gamers of my generation, I grew up in a time and place where most people didn't play video games, and barely even acknowledged them as a serious artistic medium. During those years, I'd often try to share my favorite games with friends and family members, showing them cutscenes, letting them watch me play, but I could tell that it just wasn't the same to them, that I wasn't able to truly convey that essence of what made these games so meaningful to me. Fortunately, it does feel like the general opinion on video games has come around since then, but still, I understand and respect that the medium is not for everyone, which is why I find it all the more important that care and attention is put into its translation to different formats, not just so that more people can enjoy the games that I like, but also to include the medium as a whole into that broader pantheon of humanity's storytelling and artistic expression. Bring them into that greater collective consciousness that adds variation and commentary, that re-evaluates and reimagines, and that altogether enriches and preserves. While I do believe qualia is a concept that can, to some extent, be captured, translated, and conveyed to others, at the end of the day, it is best to experience it for yourself. And so even though I might try to explain to you, let's say, the joy of exploring the riches of cinema, the excitement of starting a new movie for the first time, not yet knowing that over the course of 2 hours or so it will affect you deeply, and maybe even change the way you look at or feel about certain things, I would of course love for you to understand this sensation directly and intimately. And for that, I highly recommend you check out friend of the channel and the sponsor of today's video, Mubi. Mubi is a curated cinema streaming exceptional movies from around the world. They have a vast library of amazing movies from newly emerging filmmakers as well as from established masters, with each and every one of them being carefully hand-selected to provide you with the best that cinema has to offer. And if you go to mubi.com/likestoriesofold, you can try Mubi for free for 30 days. So be sure to claim your extended free trial to start your month of great cinema today.